I'd like to introduce you our next speaker. Once I have your attention, I'm going to be doing that. So thank you, everybody. Thank you for being here with us enduring this psychedelic marathon. We're moving next to another substance that is not actually a plant, but is, as I said, the plant medicine track has kind of loose designation. So I'm introducing Professor Ben Feinberg. He is Professor of Cultural Anthropology and the Chair of the Division of Social Sciences at the Warren Wilson College in Asheville, North Carolina. And he has a very interesting book. He has done long field work during many, many years in Huautla de Jimenez in Mexico, in the land of the famous Maria Sabina. The title of his book is The Devil's Book of Culture, History, Mushrooms, and Caves in Southern Texas. Please welcome to Professor Feinberg.
Mexico. Thank you. Thank you, Bia, although it's southern Mexico, not southern Texas. All right, I'm going to read probably a little quickly, but it's great to be here. So, for outsiders, the history of the Sierra Mazateca of Oaxaca began in about 1955 when the American banker Gordon Wasson visited, participated in mushroom rituals, and then wrote about his experience for Life magazine. This led to a fungus rush on the area as foreigners, led by avant-garde intellectuals but followed by thousands of countercultural pilgrims, descended on Huautla, ultimately setting up a large camp by a river a few miles outside of town. After growing tired of the scandal and disruption they caused, in 1967 the town president asked the military to intervene, and the hippies were removed. In the 1970s, the army checkpoint came down and mushroom tourism resumed on a smaller scale. Today, Huautla, as a pueblo mágico, is intimately connected with mushrooms, and local marketing draws heavily on the images of mushrooms and the iconic shaman Maria Sabina for marketing. Parts of the world that do not come to mind with great frequency, except with regard to a particular trait or quality, which has received broader recognition, often become conflated with that trait, so that the people and the trait come to signify each other. But the life of the people of the Sierra Mazateca is multifaceted, and if one lives there for any period, one realizes that the amount of time most residents spend thinking and talking about hallucinogenic mushrooms is, compared to the time spent pondering questions such as work, migration, and the dangerous geographies of kinship and social obligations, extraordinarily small. They are no more the people of the mushrooms than Texans are the people of the chicken fried steaks. Unlike many other speakers at this conference, I am not an expert on the pharmacological effects of ingesting substances such as psilocybin, nor really am I an expert on the intricacies of Mazatec shamanism, though I draw on the work of Edward Absey. But much of my time over the last 30 years in the Sierra Mazateca has been spent studying the construction of identity and the politics of representation. The discourses of mushrooms and mushroom shamanism, like those about all drugs in all contemporary societies, are largely about differentiating and defining different categories of people. My plan today is to provide an overview of the Mazatec and outsider discourses about mushrooms in the Sierra Mazateca over the last 50 or so years, and highlight the ways that these representations are fluid and dynamic and involve forms of connection and misunderstanding within and between these two large groups. But first, I want to address a basic anthropological question. Is their experience the same as ours? Can we make broad assumptions about the effects of mushrooms across cultural borders between peoples with different ontologies and social structures? In anthropology, this kind of question stimulated a great deal of attention with regard to issues like gender. Are categories such as homosexual, heterosexual, and female universally applicable and experienced in roughly the same way across cultural borders? Whether our answer is a firm yes or no, there are implications that we should be aware of. An answer of yes allows us a leap of identification with others, but ignores the basic fact that while substances may have common recognizable effects on the human brain, these shared processes are interpreted in ways that are profoundly influenced and framed by culture, history, and social relationships. By denying the possibility of the other, it projects dominant metropolitan categories, such as the individual or spirituality, onto them and allows them, their social universe, and their interpretations to be ignored, leaving Western cultural assumptions unquestioned. If indigenous experience does not offer anything different, then the role of indigenous people may be reduced to their historical function as preservers of these practices until they can be discovered by more sophisticated people, better able to understand and explain them. Local voices such as those of cures are incorporated into the story only when they can be read or modified to corroborate Western biases. Where they don't, they can be ignored or dismissed as superstitious or inauthentic. But if the answer of yes ignores the possibility of fundamentally different cultural understandings, a no answer emphasizing difference when taken to extremes can also result in problematic representations. Others may be seen as different beyond any possibility of connection or dialogue, but also static and outside of history, possessing a different kind of body and/or being. Valid Mazatec difference, then, depends upon the degree to which they can be associated with labels such as isolated, traditional, and ancient that deny the reality that practices such as the use of mushrooms are dynamic and generate meaning through the constant interaction across cultural borders in evolving social contexts. I will now give an overview of some elements of Mazatec mushroom discourse, highlighting how it has evolved. In some ways, it contrasts with Western representations. While visitors often emphasize visual experience, Mazatec shamanic practice highlights the importance of the cure as a speaker who uses a special charged and figurative form of language. Cures like Maria Sabina end each line with so, or says, highlighting that they are conveying speech coming directly from the child saints, as they call the mushrooms. Language takes on material qualities. It evokes a purifying rain as participants may experience words, as Absi writes, as luminous objects or invisible textures coming down to them from the saints and virgins. The special language of the shaman seeks out and identifies the cause of the patient's malady, which is often couched in accordance with Mesoamerican container-contained models of the body and multiple souls. The cure may identify and remove intrusive substances by sucking or inducing vomiting, or discover that a patient's soul has been lost in the wilds of the monte, or a place of confinement. Like Westerners, Mazatec speak of mushrooms as a vehicle of travel. They speak of trips and say that the substances take you far away. Shamanic language enacts and involves travel, opening up a pathway in which intermediaries, like the Mayan hero twins in the Popol Vuh, can enter spaces of symbolic and real power and intervene on behalf of their clients. This cure, recorded by Henry Munn in the 70s, used language to travel to the cities where campesinos would sell their coffee and invoked symbols of power in his chants. Where the big bank is, says. Where there is money of gold, says. While outsiders refer to the Sierra Mazateca through the tropes of isolation and the maintenance of an ancient tradition, mushroom discourse at its core has always been one of intergroup exchange and mediation, focusing on crossing the magically charged borders of day and night, sacred and profane, and us and them. Wasson, in his prologue to Maria Sabina's autobiography, tried paternalistically to defend her against the charge that she was illiterate by comparing her to ancient oral poets, painting her as living in a completely enclosed world, a fossilized version of our Euro-American past, unlike hillbillies who lack the wit to learn to read and write. This totally misses the point. Maria Sabina's shamanism did not represent an idealized, distinct culture on the cusp of its inevitable degradation, but told the story of a continually reproduced marginality within a transforming system of exploitation, in which she reads a magical book as a symbol of her appropriation of a form of power that she is very aware of. The way Mazatec people view ritual has changed over the last 50 years, as it likely had in the 50 years before that. The main change probably involves a shift in attribution in the cause of the patient's suffering. While for a previous generation, the victim's misfortune was usually caused by an accidental transgression of a sacred space, today the cause is more sinister. Cures identify the problem as the conscious malevolent action of a person in the community. This relates to a particularly resonant Mazatec word, Quashintokon, which signifies a hideous malevolence often concealed behind a mask of friendship. Absi argues that this shift reflects the loss of trust following the transformation of community through the penetration of a capitalist cash economy and political parties. Mazatec curing, then, does not separate individual from social health. The two are always intertwined. The second main change is the decline of the authority of the shaman. Individuals are more inclined to take mushrooms without one and to claim the authority to interpret their own experiences. I will now switch over to discuss the key themes of outsiders' representations of Mazatec mushroom culture practice, which are similar to themes that anthropologists have identified in other sites of so-called spiritual tourism. The first is the overwhelming, repeated to oblivion claim that the people of the Sierra Mazateca represent the preserved past. From Lawson's description of Maria Sabina as a fossilized survivor of a lost religion to the present, visitors describe Mazatecs as creatures of another time. In a recent television program on the Vice network, the American host could not help but frame his journey to Huautla in the same terms and to locate Mazatec ritual through the past tense. An expert explained why the Mazatecs used this, and the host added that indigenous groups preserved religious traditions and that he journeyed to Huautla, falsely described as a small and secluded mountain town, because I hope to learn if the tradition he observed has remained the same. The Mazatec are consistently described through the rhetoric of discovery, and the episode is framed as a rite of passage, a journey that begins and ends in a hyper-modern urban world marked with the signifiers of scientific and avant-garde authority, and passes through a world of Mazatec shamanism framed as part of the past, whose function is to inscribe the first world host with authenticity. These tales of the mushroom people fix Mazatecs in a limited role as passive bearers of an unchanging tradition. Now that their historical function has been met, it's time to pass on the torch to a more enlightened and sophisticated foreigners who, quote, discovered them. Maria Sabina joined with other commodified icons of Latin American culture as a t-shirt next to Che Guevara and Frida Kahlo, or indigenous wisdom as a source of inspiration for high culture. Like La Malinche of Mexican nationalist myth, the lover and translator of Cortez who revealed indigenous secrets, the Mazatecs lose any right to agency. As the Mexican rock band El Tri sang, she functions only as a symbol of wisdom and love, ancient generic Western projections of spirituality. Her role is to show us the path and then die, and it is clear who gets to be included in us. A second theme is the lack of interest in local culture, history, or language. Only a few, a special few, but only a few of the many mushroom-seeking visitors to Huautla I have talked to express curiosity about Mazatec interpretations of healing or the social and political landscape of the region. As in other forms of adventure travel, there is minimal attempt to get to know strangers, to risk one's emotional and mental comfort zones, and disturb any preconceived ideas. The countercultural visitors of the 60s who I talked to emphasized their own future-oriented utopian community, which was connected to other spaces of a globe-trotting drug culture. Huautla was the poor man's Nepal, not a region in Oaxaca. As in other locations of spiritual tourism, an individualized spiritual journey replaces any broader social and cultural understanding of the local situation, beyond the incorporation of native peoples as symbols of authentic purity. While most Mazatec healers who have attracted a small foreign clientele have remained poor and been unable to transcend the unequal nature of the exchange, a few entrepreneurs have been able to position themselves as cultural mediators in ways that are very lucrative. One, in particular, has benefited greatly by the way that outsider discourse leads to uncritical celebration of a few culture brokers seen through a stereotypical lens. Julieta Casimiro is the most famous and wealthy living Mazatec curer and is celebrated as one of the 13 indigenous grandmothers. This website demonstrates the way her image circulates globally. She is totally removed from her local social, cultural, and political context through generic imagery of commodified indigenousness, generic native wisdom about protecting the environment, and the description of an always already hybridized curing tradition as ancient and pre-Hispanic. the misrepresentation of cosmopolitan Huautla as a village, and the mystification of Julieta's economic activities as a benevolent organization of village women. In fact, Julieta and her family are powerful figures in a complex local and regional politics closely tied to the PRI, the dominant political party. In 1994, her son, known as El Diablo, was photographed beating a retired teacher to death because he was involved in a political protest against the gubernatorial candidate. El Diablo was never arrested and is still politically active and a constant presence in Julieta's household, along with her cosmopolitan and international clients. My final point will involve visitors' accounts of their experiences with mushrooms. In most cases, people describe these experiences as very positive and express warm feelings towards their hosts. While their accounts overlap with those of my Mazatec informants, their stories stress different themes, and some cures have changed their practices to accommodate these. One theme is a certain ambivalence about the trappings of ritual and a reinscription of difference between the individualist Westerner and so seemingly ritualist Indians. A Dutch traveler told me that he participated in a mushroom ritual in Huautla, but was largely bemused by the experience, concluding, quote, that my white skin and Western mind would forever deny me experiences of the archaic kind. Then he ate more mushrooms alone in the city. There was no ritual, he wrote, no observation of purity rites, no healer present. I took them for fun and nothing else. To my astonishment, I had what I can only call a profound spiritual experience. I remain unconvinced either way, agnostic. This story of a profound experience that results ultimately from the individualist triumph of the embodied rationality of the visitor is fairly frequent and emphasizes the contrast between the self-oriented search for meaning and the emphasis on collective subjectivity in Mazatec healing. In response, some Mazatec cures have embraced a customer service model. When I met Ines in '93, she would require that her clients obeyed various rules, such as fasting, wearing light colors, and putting away watches, and staying in the musty, dirt-covered altar room of her house, where she would sing and chant to them throughout the night. Today, her practice has changed. Shamans, she argues, can't really see their clients' issues or cure them. Only the client can do that. She has also dropped the rules. Why tell them to do something that makes them uncomfortable? She has used her experience to develop a series of national stereotypes about her customers, many of whom are Japanese, and she was highlighted in a Japanese travel blog. Mis japonesitos, she says, don't like being in the altar room, and they don't like it when I sing. They would rather be in the corridor and left alone. In fact, this January I observed two separate Japanese visitors, and both asked to be left alone on the roof of her house, where they took photographs of the town and selfies to share with friends. The current renaissance in the scientific understanding of psychedelic substances has an opportunity to break with the false image of Mazatecos as belonging only to the past and to recognize the value of Mazatec knowledge. But that seems unlikely. Instead, we may see a contrast between local experiences bound within a static context and Western experiences represented as universal discoveries about medicine. In fact, the very representation of psychedelic practices as plant medicine erases people from the equation. While Mazatec cures could tell you, if in different ways and different times, that the ceremonial ingestion of the child saints is medicinal, they would be invoking a view of curing that goes beyond the plant and the individual brain and body, but involves at a fundamental level other people. And the idea of medicine often implies, like the spiritual narratives of earlier Western visitors to Huautla, a purely individual experience that can be isolated from its social context, bracketing out issues like power and social inequality. And it is this insight about the essentially social nature of health and disease that I find most alluring in Mazatec mushroom curing and can be obscured by science-ifying narratives about the effects that mushrooms have on Western individuals. In an era of the Americanization of mental illness and the imposition of culturally specific diagnoses such as anorexia and PTSD in contexts where they don't fit local misunderstandings, research into psychedelic curing has the danger of further naturalizing culturally specific understandings. The first scientific researcher I ever met in Huautla was in 1994. He'd conducted experiments in Germany in laboratory conditions and had come all the way to Huautla to try out mushrooms for himself for the first time. I met him as he purchased a bag over coffee, and then I saw him the next day after he had taken them alone in his hotel room. I asked him why he had come all this way to take these alone, and he said he wanted to be here in this place, but he didn't really want to have to talk to anyone. He couldn't even speak Spanish. Then he left. This story illustrates a popular outsider approach that says, give me the place, and the credibility extors from its hundreds of years of history. But don't let the people be other than a postcard to look at. They can't have anything relevant to add. So let's undiscover Mazatec intellectuals and campesinos by engaging with them instead, and not just of iconic reminders of an ancient past that is no longer relevant, and not as stereotypical wise elders or superstitious dupes, but as people whose perspectives sometimes may make sense and challenge the cultural frameworks, even the scientific ones that frame our own understandings. Let's ditch the idea that curing and everything that goes along with it is just about us and only happens in our own brains. Thank you.
Hello? Oh, sorry. We do have time for a few questions. I just want to make a comment that on our previous round of presentations, I was commenting that sometimes anthropologists that work with indigenous people have strong feelings about the New Age movement. And I was trying to share with the audience where different colleagues stand on this spectrum. I myself am an anthropologist that have been working a lot in this interface between indigenous traditions and more contemporary and urban religious new movements and so on. And I asked my previous colleagues to explain a little bit about this debate. I think you you have illustrated well enough what I asked others to explain, which is some strong feelings about, you know, some of the processes that are going on. And I guess I would ask to you if you could perhaps further elaborate on you have pointed how our ideas of plant medicine are in a way decontextualized from the practices from where they originate, and how we tend to exclude indigenous voices, and the context and the importance of relationships, and how relationships play a role in healing. So I would invite you to go a step further, and in the context of psychedelic science and the big wave of studies on psilocybin mushrooms and all this appearance of knowledge, if you have any comments about this relationship between what's going on in science and mushrooms in Huautla de Jimenez.
All right, yeah, thank you. And I'd like, of course, to preface that I am very, very far from, am I on? Yeah, an expert on this subject of psilocybin. And I would also want to sort of step away from the idea that I would be defending a notion that there is a kind of authentic, original Mazatec practice which is completely different from outsiders, or that they should stay completely apart. But if you do look at the talk surrounding mushrooms and how people believe that they work, they are generally also about curing social relationships. Everything in Huautla is about social relationships. It's about identifying the causes of them. So if I accidentally have crossed a stream at noon that belongs to a particular duende, that has created a kind of social disimbalance that needs a sort of act to restore and recreate that harmony. Or in contemporary periods, people say, yes, it's good to take mushrooms to know who is harming you, which is about a different kind of critique of the relationships that may happen in the community. So, like other Mesoamerican views of identity, Mazatec and Huautla views of identity always at their core include the other as a component of the self, and they include relationships with the other. And so I don't want to say that any sort of interactions between non-Mazatec people and Mazatec people are somehow false or inauthentic. But it is clear that almost every account of healing that I encounter emphasizes in some way, obliquely or clearly, that what is being healed is the social as well as the self.
This kind of picks up on that. I just wanted to ask about, you mentioned, I can't remember the word for it, but it was this sort of like malicious person, which sounded to me like witchcraft, which is found in a lot of cultures, which again, not to make that a universal category, but which I think also in a kind of common pre-modern concept of the social body in a way that you like cure, the social body. So I was wondering if you could talk some more about what is that malicious person? What's that concept? And I think that's a kind of common phenomenon within Mexico. It's kind of an exaggerated version of the notion of envy, and the notion that, which is something that anybody who lives in rural Mexico sort of fears, the dangerous qualities of envy that people have. And yes, that can be associated with, in this case, the notion that physical harm comes from the intentional actions of someone motivated by, often it's something, and that's not to say that that actually may be what happens, but a nice example would be a good friend of mine who had never taken mushrooms, although other people in her family had. And then her husband abandoned her with 2 small children, and she decided to take them by herself, violating a lot of the kind of social rules, as people increasingly do, and really discovered that she saw images of her husband's sisters who were very envious of her throwing dirt on her door. The sisters were upset because she refused to have more than 2 children. She was able to use this knowledge to get her husband to come back, and she said to him, "Sit in your chair, that's your chair. If you don't think I can have more children, I'll prove it with another man, but you're only having 2. And he's been sitting in that chair and being a good guy for the last 25 years. So, yeah.
Hi, thanks so much for your talk. I used to work in the Johns Hopkins research program as a researcher and session guide.
Right.
And so I like to tell people that I actually know a lot about synthetic psilocybin and almost nothing about where it came from. So thank you for starting to fill some of those gaps. There's a myth about what Maria Sabina said about her experience with synthetic psilocybin, and I'm curious if you could talk about that myth as much as you can to debunk it or clarify it, but also if some of the living women healers would be open to taking psilocybin in its synthetic form to help clarify the current answer to that question.
Well, that's a great question. And as far as whether people would be willing to take it in its synthetic form, I can't really speak to that. My guess would be that some might. My guess would be that many would not. As with almost every other question within the Sierra Mazateca, there's no single sole official Mazatec position. People are, as in any other place, have a constant running debate about what's appropriate, what's authentic, what's useful to do. I think people would be a little bit suspicious of that. As far as, I'm not really sure what the myth is with Maria Sabina. I know there's a lot of myths about her.
Yeah, can I
Sure.
jump in? So I think this is a great question, and I'm sorry this is the last. So allegedly, Maria Sabina was given synthetic psilocybin and asked what did she think of it, and was there spirit in it, and was that the same as mushroom? And almost all biomedical researchers always quote this phrase, always saying, yes, and her answer was yes. She said, she recognized psilocybin as the same thing of mushrooms and said there was spirit there, and then everybody you see, they want to solve a very hard epistemological question with this phrase that circulates around. And I think I've seen a lecture of Jonathan Ott, which he plays with this idea, and he says, it's like you go into an old lady's house, an indigenous woman, and you bring your cake, your food, and you give it for her to try, and she said, yes, son, it's good. We like it. I mean, you can't. I just leave it like that. I don't think that Maria Sabina can be quoted as giving the blessings for psilocybin versus mushroom, and all the problems are resolved. And I sincerely hope that the plant medicine track is a little step in forwarding, giving more depth to this discussion. And with that, I thank also you again.
Thank you. Thanks.